The cloud server. Okay. So thank you so much. Greetings, everyone. Welcome to Anthroperspectives. I'm Keith Kellerson. I'm an applied business and organizational anthropologist. This week I have with me Dr. Elizabeth Briody, who is also an applied business and organizational anthropologist and has a strong career in the automotive industry as well as consulting, and has her own consulting firm called Cultural Keys, LLC. Well, thank you for taking the time to talk to us today. I've given you a brief introduction, even though I've known you for quite some time. But why don't you tell everyone a little bit about yourself and your career history?
Well, hello, everyone. Thank you, Keith, for inviting me to participate in this program. And it's great to be able to share a little bit of my story with your audience. I've been an anthropologist my entire professional career. Took my 3 degrees in anthropology, and then when I finished graduate school, I was lucky to land a job at General Motors Research Laboratories in Michigan, and that's where I stayed for almost 24 years. I had an opportunity to work with employees, and so really the focus of my anthropological research was on organizational culture and organizational change. In 2009, you may recall that the automotive companies were going through great difficulty. I lost my job with GM's bankruptcy and thought, now what'll I do? And the answer was, well, I guess I'll just go ahead and do what I've always done, which is to try to understand what organizational cultures are like and help those cultures become more effective. And so I opened up my own consulting practice called Cultural Keys, as Keith mentioned. And with that, I have had an opportunity to work in a variety of industries, including petrochemicals, pet food, hospitals, insurance, all kinds of interesting research opportunities. And that's where I still am working today.
Great. Now, I remember that 2008, 2009 economic kind of crash we had during that time. I was actually also living in Michigan at the time, and I didn't know you, but that was the time when I got the job offer to move to Maryland. And I knew at that point, you know, this is the time to leave Michigan because of everything that was going on. And I had, you know, I was in Michigan. I lived there pretty much my whole life since I was 4 years old. And I am, you know, a Michigan native. And so it was tough. It was really, really a tough time. But, you know, you adjust, you adapt.
That's right.
As anthropologists do, we adapt. So, yes. So you were at General Motors, and you actually, you know, they knew you were an anthropologist. You weren't employed as an anthropologist, correct?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
They knew you were an anthropologist. And
oh, yes.
You were employed as an anthropologist, correct?
That's correct. They hired me to be GM's anthropologist.
That is something. And you even got to work on the assembly line, correct?
I would not quite phrase it exactly like that.
Right.
That would, if I had worked on the assembly line, that would have been considered a United Auto Workers violation.
Oh, okay, that's interesting.
I was salaried. However, I did spend a lot of time talking with people and observing people work who were on the plant floor. And that did include assemblers, material handlers, repair technicians, and foremen, general foremen, etc.
Wow. So what kind of insights did you gain there, and how did your use of anthropology help the manufacturing process?
Well, I had 2 very different projects during my time at GM working in manufacturing environments, both of which were making vehicles. The first time I was just a brand new employee, and I was working alone, as anthropologists have done in the past, less so now, I'm glad to see. But early on, I was invited to work with a woman who published the plant newsletter. And so she became a bit of a mentor to me and helped me to learn the ropes, what I could do and couldn't do on the plant floor. And she was a good person who provided me access to certain people. So with her help and just, I guess, my ability to build rapport with people on the line, I started to learn about how this particular plant operated. It made trucks and buses. It also made the chassis for the UPS vehicles that you see. And in that plant, the most amazing thing I found was that it was characterized by blaming. People would blame each other for things that were going haywire in the plant. And so then the question was, why? Why were things so crazy? Inventory was lost. The trucks or buses would be coming off the line and needing immediate repair. This was way before the quality had really taken hold in automotive, although it was coming at that point. And so I figured out what was going on in terms of the blaming, in terms of if you mapped it out on the plant floor, and ended up producing a research report, and that actually became a chapter in one of my books, which is The Cultural Dimensions of Global Business.
How did they respond? How did they respond to the report on blaming, and how did they sort of take that information?
Yeah, I remember going into the plant manager's office with my boss, and we had the report. He totally accepted the notion that people blamed each other for things that were going wrong in the plant. But he did not accept that the plant was suffering enormous quality issues. And he did not accept that there was a contradiction between what the managers in the plant said was important and what was actually important. So what they said was important was quality. Quality is number one. There were signs all over the place, newsletters, training classes going on in quality, and so on. But really what counted was getting that truck or bus out the door. And so quotas turned out to be far more important than quality.
Interesting.
And so he rejected that notion with no evidence behind him. And so unfortunately, those were the days when GM was undergoing tremendous transition, and leaders in the company were really not sure, I think, of how to respond to someone like me, who was basically just out of school, telling them that, you know, their plant was just experiencing tremendous difficulties.
Wow. You know, and I'm sure most of the people who are going to watch this, you know, probably don't have the experience in the automobile industry or on the assembly line or in plants, but they can probably relate to this blame game notion that probably goes on at work,
right,
in their organization, you know. And even with my own work, I found that absolutely the blame game is probably the easiest thing to do, because, you know, at the end, much like the story you've told, it kind of almost frees leadership from taking responsibility and making meaningful change within the organization. So it's kind of a cop-out, right?
Yes and no. I mean, people know that people knew then that there was blaming, but they didn't know how it was distributed. And so it turns out that you would blame people who were upstream from you
Mhm.
on the assembly line because they were sending you the vehicle body, which you were building as the truck would go through the assembly line process. And it would come to you and there would be a problem. You would need to attach something to this body and you couldn't do it properly because someone upstream from you had done something improperly, perhaps not intentionally or probably not intentionally, but that's just the way it was. And so now you have to deal with it. And that becomes a problem for you. And you don't, the line keeps moving and you only have so many seconds to get your part of the truck put on.
Mhm.
So that was what I found fascinating about it. You blamed people upstream, but not downstream. And you blamed people on the previous shift, not your own shift.
Right.
And you didn't blame people on your own shift because there would be times when you would need their help, such as when you needed a few extra hands or a few extra seconds to deal with an issue that was not caused by you.
Yeah.
And so you didn't want to get those people who were immediately around you upset at you, so you wouldn't blame them. Why would you do that?
Mhm. Mhm. That's fascinating. That is fascinating. So, you were also in other parts of General Motors, even within the organizational leadership itself, and you helped streamline decision-making processes. And that's what we call today, it's sort of a big buzzword, decision science, right? And it looks to me like you were doing decision science before it was, in vogue, right? And so can you tell us a little bit about that and who you worked with?
Sure. In the late 1990s, I had an opportunity to work on two different vehicle programs. When you work on a vehicle program, the people immediately around you are trained engineers, designers, and business people. And their role is to create the design and engineering documents and process, or I should say the design and engineering elements that will become part of whatever the new vehicle is. I worked on two such programs, each for 2 years, and I did it back to back. And I noticed that decisions were a huge issue. In the first case, the three different partners were working to produce a compact car that would be sold around the world. So you can think of the size of a Chevy Cavalier, if that means anything to you. The three partners were Chevy and allied with Pontiac, Saturn, and the European partner was Adam Opel. GM at the time owned Opel. The next program I worked on also had three partners. It involved GM Truck, GM do Brasil, and Isuzu. So it was a little bit different than the first one because it had a strategic alliance partner. GM had a certain percentage of equity in Isuzu, but it did not own Isuzu outright. And so I paid attention to how people were making decisions. And by that, I mean, I sat in numerous engineering meetings, numerous business meetings, and I observed and documented how people talked about things, how they arrived at decisions, if the decision got made, did it get unmade, was it contested, and so on. And what I discovered in this process, well, I discovered a number of things, but a very interesting thing that I discovered was that each of the partners had different ways of making decisions. So I'll give you a quick example from the first program. Chevy and Pontiac made decisions essentially based on majority rule. 51-49, I win, you lose. It was essentially like that. Saturn made decisions based on 100% consensus.
Wow.
So you can see the problem right off the bat.
Right, right.
And in Saturn's case, they would say to their Saturn employees, their engineers and designers, look, if you are 70% comfortable with a particular decision, you've got to say that you're in. In other words, that you are in agreement and that the decision should go ahead.
Mm-hmm.
Opal was neither majority rule nor 100% consensus. It was what the leader wanted.
Mm.
So it was kind of a top-down approach, except that the leader was typically a highly trained engineer that maintained his technical skills, unlike many American engineers. As they advance in management, they become more managerial focused and less technically focused. So the German leaders routinely would be soliciting insight from the people who worked for them. So they weren't making decisions in a vacuum. They were making decisions based on the best information that they had at the time from the people that worked in their organizations. Well, these three decision-making models obviously set up a huge problem that no one knew was even there.
Right, right.
Because when you are part of a culture, it's as if you are in the forest and you can't see through the trees. You don't know what you don't know.
Right.
And you assume that everybody thinks, acts, and makes decisions like you do.
Right.
So the Chevy people were thinking that, Opal and Saturn were making decisions just like they were, using majority rule, and they weren't. And so it basically took an outsider like me coming in and observing and figuring it out. So now, when I remember when I gave the initial presentation after a couple of months of sitting in these meetings, I remember the chief engineer kind of like throwing himself back in his chair and saying, now I get it. So in other words, he had not understood this was a fundamental problem with global product programs. If you can't make decisions in the same way, what ends up happening? You get a decision made, revisited, thought out again, pushed, pulled, and you can't make much progress. It turned out that this program, which was already in its second version, it turned out this program lasted about 2.5 years, and then it folded at a cost of 2.2 million vehicles that were never produced. And a good part of it had to do with the fact that they did not share a common approach to decision making.
And that's interesting because you had Isuzu, which is a Japanese company.
And that was a different example, but very similar in that way.
Right. And you had Opel, which is a German company.
Right.
You had a Brazilian affiliate.
Right.
So I can imagine, of course, that the way they make decisions is not only, of course, based on their organizational culture, but also highly influenced by their national culture.
Yes, though in this case, organizational culture is more important, or it has a stronger impact than national culture, because we had two American organizational cultures, right? We had Chevy, Pontiac, and then we also had Saturn.
Right.
But both of the models that they used are models that we use here in the States.
Right.
I mean, we use other models as well, but those two are certainly well-known and understood models.
Mm-hmm.
So in that case, national culture didn't have as strong of an effect. What the effect was felt because that's how the organization decided at some point in time that that was how they were going to make decisions.
Wow. That is probably one of the most fascinating stories that I've heard from you. I love that story. So you've done some consulting work and you've done some of your own, you have your own consulting business now. What other kind of industries have you worked with, and what are some of the things you've discovered?
Okay, well, I've worked in many different kinds of industries. I have not gone back to automotive, actually.
Yeah.
So I've had an opportunity to work in finance, financial advising, manufacturing of clothes, pet foods, petrochemicals, doctor's offices, hospitals. So it's been a wide array of industries and specific kinds of operations within those industries. One of the things that I discovered is that anthropologists bring something pretty unique to business,
Mm-hmm.
or to whatever kind of organization in which they're working, whether it's a nonprofit or a government agency or a non-governmental organization. It really doesn't matter. What matters is that the insights that they bring can help an organization propel itself forward into the future. So I'll give you an example.
Okay.
I did a piece of work that lasted well over a year for a hospital in the south of the US. When I was there for the first time, I think I was there for about a week, and I was paired with a hospital employee, and we visited various parts of the hospital, and I met a number of people and had a chance to have conversations with them. So I took field notes.
Mm-hmm.
And then I was asked to give my initial impressions at the hospital's annual retreat, which was happening the next month. So I went through my field notes and I looked for times when the cultural values that are posted all over the hospital, I looked for evidence that they showed up in my field notes. This was not something I had planned to do in advance. It was something that I just thought, be interesting to see, what's coming out here.
Yeah.
And they had 5 different values, 3 of which were minimally mentioned in my field notes. There were 2 others, one of which was mentioned, a number of times. And the last one, which was accountability, was mentioned 23 times. So I thought, wow, that's an interesting distribution. I wonder what these accountability comments are all about. So I went back and I looked at the content of the statements people had made in which accountability was a key word in what they were talking about. And it turned out that people were extremely upset in the hospital because their colleagues and the leaders of the hospital were not being held accountable. So that simple little comparison from my field notes actually was highly, highly significant and enabled me then to continue working with the hospital to try to understand what was going on. What was it about how the culture was working that created a situation where supposedly people weren't being held accountable? And keep in mind that that very first week, the people I was talking to were the very senior people in the hospital.
They're the ones saying that people aren't held
Yes,
accountable.
correct.
Wow.
So I think that anthropologists figure out ways, first of all, to take really good notes. And then they figure out that they figure out, based on their observations, what makes sense to them from the data that they have. And so I immediately knew, based on this figure of such high mentions of accountability, that this hospital really did have an accountability problem. And I was brought in, according to one of the key leaders, because the hospital wanted to become more patient-centric. So now you put patient-centric and lack of accountability together, and you've got a problem.
Yes.
And that problem needs a solution, or multiple solutions.
Right. So how did they try to map certain things better? Like, they knew there was an accountability problem, so they were going to, did they have some action plan afterwards about this?
They retained me for well over a year to work with a team of people to try to understand what their culture was about and how it could be improved. Unfortunately, and people told me this, that change came to that hospital based on the phenomenon that we call Program of the Month, or Flavor of the Month.
Okay.
Only I didn't know it at the time. I was the new Flavor of the Month.
Oh, I see. Right.
And so when I had to do a series of reports for them, and ultimately they opted to disregard all of the work that my team of 6 and I had done, and then they hired a marketing specialist. So culture change is difficult. There is no question about it.
Yeah, well, there takes a lot of work behind it, a lot of power and a lot of force, especially from leadership.
If firms want culture change, it seems to me that they really have to be prepared for what it might mean. And unfortunately, leaders are not always able to imagine what it might mean. So then what the anthropologist needs to do, and what is important to prepare leaders on future projects, is here are the kinds of things we are likely to identify, to give them a sense up front. Do they really want to investigate their culture, as at least they're saying they do? Or are they just doing it to make it look like they're investigating their culture? And unfortunately, in this case, it was all about making impressions, ensuring that people in the community, their own hospital board, and others felt like they were moving forward, when in fact they were moving backwards from a cultural perspective.
Yeah. And, and I found that true in my career too. Whenever there's some kind of culture survey that goes around, or some kind of improving the workplace, in the end, it seems like it's more for making sure the employees have a positive impression that management is listening to them, more than it is actually putting something in place and doing the actual hard work to change the issues within the culture, right?
It is. It does take a lot to try to change culture. There's no question about it. It is possible to do it, but to do it well, and to do it so that it's long lasting, really requires, I think, 5 key elements. And I'm going to tell you what they are, because these are based on a number of projects that I have worked on. The first thing you have to have is you have to have a collaborative group, everybody rowing in the same direction.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The second thing you have to have is buy-in from leaders.
Right.
So the leaders have to be prepared, and that's where perhaps I could have done a better job at the outset in preparing them for what some of the possible things that you could find
Mm-hmm.
in doing this kind of long-term study. The third thing that has to happen is that you have to have work practice changes.
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, the actual work that people are doing, some of that work will shift. It may shift to a different department. It may be that you're not going to do that kind of work anymore. It may be that you're going to do this new kind of work, but whatever it is, you're going to have changes in work practice. You are also going to have structural changes in the organization.
Mm-hmm.
And by that, I mean that some departments may be merged with others or eliminated. Other departments may be further developed. Rules may change. Now we are going to do A, not B. We've always done B, but now we're doing A.
Mm-hmm.
So there has to be structural change. And the fifth element, which is very important, is evidence of benefit.
Ah, right.
So you have to be able to demonstrate that the change that you put in place actually works and does what you hoped it would do.
Mm-hmm.
So if your aim was to improve working relationships between departments, many organizations are siloed. Okay, you come up with your metrics and you figure out if that was accomplished. If your intent was to save money while improving working relationships, you might have different metrics. But again, you can then check after a period of time to see if there was any evidence that the new way is better than the old way. Mm. And oftentimes in organizations, that kind of evaluation does not occur.
Right.
And it needs to occur.
Right.
Because it's so much better to operate with a sense of surety that you're doing something that is better or more effective than what you did in the past. You don't want to necessarily waste time. You want to, if you have external customers, you want to make sure that they're happy with the services or products or whatever that you're providing.
Yeah, I've seen that in organizations where they go, for the most part, they go for the structural change. They make a new organizational chart,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Move departments to this manager, and move this department to this manager.
Right.
And then people move their desks inside the building, and then we're good.
Right.
And
except we're not good.
Right, exactly. You want to ask, like, how do you know it's better? How do you know that this is working?
Right.
Well, why would you ask such a thing, right?
Right.
Kind
well, and particularly if you're doing a restructuring that involves downsizing, you're going to save a lot of money in headcount costs. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's something that you absolutely have to do, or maybe it's something that you think that will work, but have you thought about what will happen to the people who remain? Have you thought about what work will they do now? Are you expecting them to pick up all the work that was done before? Are you going to now look to see if this structural change you made actually showed any benefit? Is everyone pulling behind the new goal that the organization has? Mm-hmm. Are they collaborating? So these are the hard issues. Those 5 factors are critically important. And if any one of them is missing, you will not have sustained
house of cards
cultural change. Yeah. Just won't happen.
So tell me, I've experienced a lot of debate on LinkedIn about how is organizational culture defined? Right?
Okay.
So can you tell me, what is your definition of organizational culture and what is it not?
Well, you know, people have different definitions of it.
We do.
Psychologists have different definitions from other kinds of social scientists or behaviorals, or I should say other kinds of social scientists. So the way I think of culture is it's everything you have, think, and do. So basically it's everything.
Yeah.
It's what you're wearing. It's whether or not you own a laptop and use it.
Mm-hmm.
It is how you think about the world. And it's what day-to-day activities, tasks do you engage in and with whom. Mm-hmm. So it's pretty much everything. And in an organizational context, it simply means that the culture pertains to the organization. And as we talked about earlier with the differences in decision-making, that should make it clear that organizations have, or organizations, in organizations, culture will emerge. Let's say it's a startup. It will emerge over time and develop, and it will change for, you know, over time as well. It doesn't stay static. In fact, many people think of culture as a process. Mm-hmm. And I do think of culture as a process because right. It does evolve. Yes. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's how I consider it.
Answers my questions fine. What do you think it's not? What do you think are maybe some of the biggest misconceptions about culture?
What culture is not?
Yeah.
Well, it is not just a leadership perspective.
Ah, that's a good one.
So in organizations, particularly the ways in which organizational theorists talk about it, the leadership is a very elite group of people, and they're the ones who are said to basically be in charge of the culture.
Right,
somehow.
Right. It's their domain.
It's their domain, and they may even have a title to that effect. Mm-hmm. Some of the senior leaders may have a title to that effect, like chief culture officer or something like that. But in fact, culture belongs to everybody because everybody participates in it.
Right.
If you work in the mailroom, you are a participant of that organization's culture.
Yes.
And you have your own views. You have your own activities and tasks that you do every day. And you are expected to dress, let's say, a certain way and use certain equipment a certain way. And if something is amiss, there might be problems. Right. You might be told, no, that's not appropriate to wear to work, or you might hurt yourself because you use the equipment without having been properly trained on it, or, you know, any number of things can happen. You are part of that organization and how that organization works. So you have to learn it. As a newcomer, you learn what the cultural rules are, and you learn it often by making mistakes.
It's true.
And then you get it.
Very true. I often wonder too if, you know, sometimes, I mean, maybe you didn't have the situation where, you know, an organization hires an anthropologist to work on their organizational culture, and leadership gets a little squeamish about that because that's their domain, right?
Right, exactly right.
What is this anthropologist going to uncover, and how is that going to make us look, right?
Right. There are those concerns.
Yeah, yeah. So, but I think that, you know, leaders are so busy doing projects for their boss, who are doing projects for their boss, who are doing projects for their boss, they really aren't day-to-day engaged in sort of the cultural work that goes on. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, well, I mean, leaders have a perspective, and a very important perspective. They also have access to lots of external parties. Mm-hmm. It could be government people, could be other business people, community people. And so their viewpoint often is much broader than someone who is much further down in the organization's rankings, or rank, I should say. So it's not a question of is one perspective right or wrong. It's what it really is about is the multiplicity of viewpoints that exist about how a culture works, how you get things done in this particular culture, because typically you will run into roadblocks and you've got to come up with workarounds in order to get done what you've been asked to do. You've been charged to do something, so you've got to figure it out. And so people adjust to what they have to do, or after, if they can adjust, they leave, or they're told to leave.
Yeah. Great. So just a couple more questions I have for you. What do you think are the top skills that anthropologists can bring to any company?
Anthropologists are amazingly good at understanding people's perspectives. In fact, we have a specialized term that we use to indicate that. It's called the EMIC, E-M-I-C perspective, or the insider perspective. Sometimes people refer to it as the native perspective. So in other words, whoever you are doing a project for, maybe a research project of some type, the people that are working with you are the people whose perspectives you want to capture and you want to understand, because eventually you will be able to see how the whole thing fits together. So that's one element. Another element is the notion of holism, that anthropologists will look across time and across space to try to understand how something is operating. If some particular element has had a long-term history within the company, chances are it's still there. And I will use the example of General Motors. It was formed in 1908 from a number of different car companies, and that's why it's called General Motors. Those companies were allowed to retain their independence in terms of engineering, manufacturing, designing, and so on, produce their own products, etc. They were only joined together financially. That notion, which I have referred to as autonomy, is still evident today. It appears in the idea of people operating independently of the whole. Now, it's far better now than it was back in 1908. But back in 1908, you basically had a bunch of different car companies that were sort of strung together. Now you have a far more integrated firm, but that concept of individualism and autonomy is still alive and well. And you will still have organizations, you know, tussling to get their view of the world and their expectations selected for whatever the decision might be. So holism matters, emic perspective matters. Of course, the culture concept is critically important. Anthropologists also will compare. And the comparison helps them to see what is there and what isn't there. So for example, when I looked at the various key themes that the hospital wanted to emphasize, that was part of their mission and values, the one that stood out was accountability. All the other ones were, you know, just perfectly acceptable values, respect, and, you know,
Right.
that kind of thing. But accountability stood out. And it also stood out because the numbers were so high, so many different mentions in the field notes compared to all the other ones. So that ability to compare and contrast is something that anthropologists routinely use. And then I think there's one other, more of a methodological element that anthropologists pick up on, and that is the use of specialized terms and phrases. When someone is talking with you and uses a term or phrase that is sometimes jargon, but sometimes unexpected, surprising, we notice it. And other people, if they were trained, would notice it too and comment on it. So for example, if we heard, oh, he's coming in with his entourage. Okay, that's a pretty loaded term, entourage. Normally you would say he is coming in with the people that report to him, or he is coming in with some key leaders. But the fact that you said entourage signals you got to pay attention here because something else is going on. Another example is if you hear a boss say, you need to get your house in order. Okay, there's a problem the boss doesn't like. We don't know quite what that problem is, but clearly the message has been delivered. If you hear, I was giddy with happiness. We don't, as a rule, use the word giddy very often. We might just say, well, you know, I was really happy when this happened.
Right.
But the fact that the person uses the word giddy, which is something that appeared in my field notes, it suggests that there's something else going on, something more powerful, something that we can't see yet because we haven't heard enough, or we haven't observed enough. So I think that anthropologists are just tuned in to those kinds of things. When I started that first product program, my very first interview was with one of the German guys. And he asked me a couple of questions about why did I want to work on this project? And I answered him. I just said, well, you know, I just think it's fascinating that you're trying to build a car that can be sold all around the world. And he said, well, you should have been at this meeting today. It was a classic. And then he takes his fist and pounds it on the table. Okay, so first of all, he said it was a classic. Okay, so you know something else is going on. But then the added motion of his hand, emphasis.
Right.
And I said to myself, okay, I'm in.
Wow. Yeah, that alone, you know, I would think that anthropologists that would intrigue anthropologists.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, something is ambiguous here, and I don't know what it means, so I need to find out, and I need to get in there.
Right. Exactly right. So I think, you know, when people are on the job market, and they're either, you know, they're talking with members of their network, eventually they hope to land some informational interviews and ultimately land a job interview, and then finally be offered a position. Okay. You want to be able to talk about anthropology's value to an employer.
Yeah.
And this is a critical issue because many employers haven't got a clue what anthropology is. At best,
Absolutely.
they know it's like archaeology,
right.
Or bones and stones, or pith helmets, or, you know, some other kind of
Indiana
moniker.
Jones, you know.
Right, that kind of thing. And all of that is part of anthropology. That's not the point. But many anthropologists are what we call cultural anthropologists, who are trained in modern day peoples and who focus generally on the culture, sometimes also on language, by the way. So what is the value of anthropology? Well, there are many aspects, and I've already talked about some in terms of the skill set, but, you know, anthropologists notice things.
Mhm.
I went with a businessman, a medical doctor, and two medical doctors and a businessman once to persuade a pharmaceutical to give us some money, seed money. And we got there and we were sitting in the conference room waiting for the people to come in. And they finally came in. No one shook our hands. They were talking among themselves. Honestly, it didn't feel very good.
Mm.
We sat there. The meeting was set to last an hour. People were, looking at their phones and all this. And finally, the meeting got started, and we were asked to explain why we wanted the money. And we did it in a way that all of a sudden caught their attention. And we left that meeting thinking it had gone very well. And the businessman said to me, "How do you think the meeting went?" And I said, as soon as they started smiling, I relaxed. And he started laughing. But that's what I noticed. I noticed the nonverbal behavior. That's what anthropologists focus, not the only thing they focus on, but that is one of the things that is part of the training.
Yeah.
You can tell a story from some work you've done. And that could be a compelling piece of evidence that anthropology is valuable. You could talk about the importance of interviews over survey data. What do you get out of an interview compared to a survey?
Mm-hmm.
You could talk about the value of ethnography, although you may have to tell them what that is,
Mm-hmm.
over simple qualitative data.
Right.
And you might say the unexpected. So, for example, a program officer once said to me, qualitative work is not much more than opinion.
Oh.
Yeah, that was kind of a tough one. And I came back with, think of it this way. An economist gave a paper with many correlations. The anthropologist came along and asked, but what does it mean?
Right.
So the point is that ethnography can answer the question, why?
Right.
So there are many, many different strategies to demonstrate anthropology's value. Those are just a few of them.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the why, in some of my discussions with people on LinkedIn, especially those who are working in quantitative data research.
Yes.
They say, I feel like my company we have all this data, but we don't know why.
Right.
And some of the people who have reached out to me saying, know about anthropology or know about qualitative research and would say to me, if only we had someone like you who could tell us why this is the way it is.
Right.
Right. And I think sometimes companies, they think, oh gosh, qualitative data, that's more research. That's just anecdotal evidence anyway.
Right.
And we don't want to spend all this time doing all this stuff. But yet they're spending all this time arguing about or debating about what the quantitative data means.
Right.
Trying to make a decision based solely on that after long periods of discussion and analysis paralysis. So I say, first of all, of course, qualitative data is not anecdotal evidence by any stretch of the means.
Right.
So I always say, take the time and invest in the qualitative research, because that's just gonna, and then, it's gonna reinforce your quantitative data that much more. And then eventually you're gonna have an ethnography put together with everything and the research and the correlations and all of those things. So I would hope someday, like you were talking about futurism, I would hope someday that some companies would venture out a little bit more and get into that qualitative research to reinforce the quantitative data.
Well, I think that is happening with some big data firms or
Yes.
firms who have got big data, mining big data, and they bring on, and I've heard of a few instances of anthropologists being brought in to help in that regard. And I think that's a great step forward, because there's no reason in the world for an anthropologist to be working alone.
Right.
That doesn't work well
Right.
in the workplace of today, even though we are all online with COVID-19.
Right.
Working in teams is just a much better way to go, because you can bounce ideas off of each other. You can get the work done better because each person has different skills. There's no reason an anthropologist should be working alone. If I were working with someone else trained in a totally different field, you do have to take some time to provide some understanding of what it is that you can do, and that person the same. But when you start working together, it seems to me that each can ping off of each other, ask each other the hard questions, and force each other to be better together than alone.
Right. Right.
And I would like to see that kind of trend take off to a far greater extent in graduate schools. Business schools have been doing it for years with project work, and also some of the professional schools in universities. But some of the disciplinary-based schools are not really doing as much that way. They expect individual students to go and do a paper, let's say, or a final project, and it's often on an individual basis, and it's all about credit. And and I just think the value of working with other people gets you stronger faster. It forces you to learn quicker.
Right. That's that strength and diversity.
Right, exactly. And that's not to say that there won't be problems. There will be problems.
Absolutely.
But you got to work them out. There's going to be conflict.
Yep.
There will be people on your team who may not pull their full weight for whatever reason, intentional or not intentional. But that's life. And working together in general is far better than working alone.
Absolutely. So for my last question, you've already kind of answered this, but it kind of flips the script a little bit. What do hiring managers and recruiters need to know about the anthropological skill set? And the reason I ask this is I can imagine that many people who have anthropology backgrounds that apply for a job, recruiters are probably looking at their resume and saying, anthropology, this has nothing to do with anything that we do here at this company. What is this? And let it go. So what do you think they need to know to appreciate anthropology for their business?
I think the single most important concept is the concept of culture. So I would say, I would talk to them about the culture of their enterprise. Ask them questions about it. I mean, this would be if I were engaging with them in a discussion, whether it was an informational interview or whether it was an actual job interview, or whether I was actually hired now and just talking with somebody who worked in the same workplace. I would want to help them understand what culture is and see what their understanding of culture is. So I think that is the single most important thing that recruiters and potential prospective employers need to know about anthropology.
And culture is really big right now. It's a big discussion among a lot of companies and has been for quite some time. I would just hope that recruiters and hiring managers would know enough to equate culture with anthropology instead of Indiana Jones with anthropology.
Right. Well, I mean, I think with some small amount of discussion, you can get the ball rolling. And so most of my time when I'm talking with new people that I've not met before, and they're curious about what does an anthropologist do, I will talk about culture. just very generally. Sometimes I tell them the story that I told you today about Opel and Saturn and Chevy.
Yeah.
You know, and then they get it. They understand from that little story what culture is. I mean, they don't necessarily grasp the whole thing, but they get the fact that there are differences. They get the fact that the three groups could not work together very well, and they get the fact that the program failed.
Yeah.
So stories can be extremely helpful.
Yes, they can. You need to be a good storyteller as an anthropologist, I do believe.
I'm still working on that.
I am too. So anything else you want to add? Gosh, this was a great talk today. I'm so glad we were able to do this. I just really appreciate your time so much.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. No, I'm all set.
Fantastic. Well, thank you again so much. And I know everyone who watches this is going to love this interview. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you, Keith. Bye.
Bye, Elizabeth.